Hermann Hesse stands as one of the 20th century's most misunderstood philosophical voices, often reduced to a prophet of easy self-discovery when his actual project was far more demanding and tragic. Born in 1877 in the Black Forest region of Germany, Hesse spent 7 decades wrestling with a central problem that would define not just his fiction, but an entire philosophical worldview. How does a human being become genuinely themselves in a world designed to make authentic selfhood nearly impossible? The common misreading of Hesse treats him as an advocate of spiritual tourism, someone who simply said, "Go east, young man, find yourself, and all will be well." This interpretation has done enormous damage to understanding what Hesse actually proposed. His philosophy was not about escape, but about an excruciating confrontation with the multiplicity within oneself, a recognition that the self is not a unity to be discovered, but a battlefield where opposing forces wage eternal war. 3 major intellectual currents shaped Hesse's thinking, and understanding their collision is essential. First, the German Romantic tradition, particularly the ideas of Novalis and the early Romantics who believed in transcendence through inwardness. Second, the depth psychology of Carl Jung, with whom Hesse underwent analysis and whose concepts of the shadow, individuation, and the collective unconscious became foundational to his work. Third, Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism and Taoism, which Hesse encountered through his reading and his journey to India in 1911. But here is what makes Hesse philosophically serious rather than merely eclectic. He did not synthesize these traditions into some harmonious whole. Instead, he held them in permanent tension, using each to critique and complicate the others. His philosophy is not a system, but a method of sustained contradiction, and this is precisely where both its power and its problems emerge. To understand Hesse's ideas requires understanding 4 central domains where his thinking operates: the nature of authentic selfhood and why it demands suffering, the relationship between spirit and sensuality that he called the primal duality, his diagnosis of what modern bourgeois society does to human possibility, and his vision of artistic creation as the only genuine path to meaning in a meaningless world. Each of these domains contains profound insights and significant failures, moments of philosophical brilliance and moments of what his critics rightly call narcissistic evasion. Part 1. The Journey to Selfhood as Philosophical Method. Hesse's central philosophical contribution, the idea that has influenced millions and deserves both serious attention and serious critique, is his conception of the journey to selfhood as the fundamental human task. This is not self-help psychology dressed up in literary language. It is a rigorous philosophical anthropology, a theory about what human beings are and what we must do to live authentically. The core claim is this: we are born into a false self, a socially constructed identity that our families, schools, churches and cultures impose upon us. This false self is not merely a mask we wear. It is a prison we inhabit, and most people live their entire lives without ever suspecting that the walls are not real. The task of individuation, to use Jung's term that Hesse adopted, is to demolish this false self and discover or create the authentic self beneath. But here Hesse makes a move that separates him from both Eastern mysticism and Western romanticism. The authentic self is not waiting to be discovered like a treasure buried in the psyche. Instead, it must be created through a process of what Hesse called going through oneself. This phrase, which appears throughout his work, means something precise and demanding. You must experience and integrate every contradictory impulse, every shameful desire, every rejected possibility within yourself. You cannot skip over the darkness to reach the light. This is where Hesse's reading of depth psychology becomes crucial. Jung's concept of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, becomes for Hesse not just a psychological fact, but an ethical imperative. The journey to selfhood requires confronting your shadow, accepting that you contain the capacity for everything you despise. The saint must acknowledge the murderer within, the ascetic must acknowledge the sensualist, the rationalist must acknowledge the mystic. Let us make this concrete with an example from Hesse's most philosophically dense novel, Steppenwolf, published in 1927. The protagonist, Harry Haller, believes himself to be divided between two natures, the cultured spiritual man and the savage wolf. This binary is his false self, his way of organizing experience that allows him to feel superior while also feeling tortured. The novel's philosophical project is to destroy this comfortable duality and reveal that Haller contains not two selves, but thousands. In the Magic Theatre sequence, near the end of Steppenwolf, Haller encounters multiple versions of himself in a hallucinatory experience that functions as philosophical argument. He meets himself as a murderer, as a sensualist, as a tame bourgeois, as a wild revolutionary. The point is not that he should choose which self is real. The point is that authentic selfhood means accepting that all of these are real, that the self is not a unity, but a multiplicity, and that maturity means learning to orchestrate this multiplicity rather than imposing a false coherence. This leads to Hesse's concept of what he called the game of life. In his novel The Glass Bead Game, published in 1943, Hesse presents a vision of human existence as play, but play in the most serious sense. Life becomes authentic when we stop taking our provisional identities as fixed essences and instead treat them as roles we can step into and out of. This is not relativism or nihilism. It is a recognition that meaning is created through form and art rather than discovered in some external metaphysical truth. Now we must examine where this philosophy succeeds and where it fails, because both are instructive. The strength of Hesse's position is its psychological realism about the constructed nature of identity. Modern psychology and neuroscience have largely confirmed what Hesse intuited. There is no unitary self, no central command center in the brain that constitutes the essential you. The self is an ongoing process of integration across multiple subsystems, and the feeling of unified selfhood is itself a construction. Moreover, Hesse's insistence on the necessity of suffering in the journey to selfhood avoids the superficiality of much contemporary self-help culture. He understood that genuine transformation requires dismantling your existing identity, and this is terrifying and painful. You cannot become yourself without first ceasing to be who you think you are. This is a genuine insight with ancient philosophical roots in traditions from Buddhism to Stoicism. But here is where the serious critiques begin, and they cannot be dismissed. First, there is the problem of what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls radical reflexivity. Hesse's philosophy encourages an endless turning inward, a constant examination of whether your current self is authentic or merely another mask. This can lead to a kind of psychological paralysis, where you become so focused on the authenticity of your experience that you cannot simply have experiences. The Marxist critic Georg Lukács, who was otherwise sympathetic to literary modernism, attacked Hesse for what he called bourgeois inwardness. Lukács argued that Hesse's philosophy is fundamentally a retreat from political reality, a way for privileged individuals to avoid confronting their complicity in systems of oppression by obsessing over their inner authenticity. The journey to selfhood, in this critique, becomes a luxury available only to those who do not have to worry about material survival. This critique has real force. Hesse's major characters are almost always educated, economically secure men who have the leisure to embark on spiritual quests. The question of how a factory worker or a single mother would pursue individuation is never addressed. Hesse assumes a degree of freedom from necessity that is simply unavailable to most human beings. Second, there is the gender problem that feminist critics have rightly emphasized. In Hesse's philosophy, women almost always function as symbols rather than as subjects undertaking their own journeys to selfhood. They are the central pole in the spirit versus nature duality, objects that men use in their self-development rather than autonomous agents. In Narcissus and Goldmund, one of his most philosophically explicit novels, women exist only as temporary lovers who help Goldmund understand himself, never as people with their own journeys. Third, and perhaps most damning, there is the question of whether Hesse's philosophy contains any ethical content beyond the imperative to be authentic. The philosopher Theodor Adorno raised this objection in his critique of what he called the jargon of authenticity. If authenticity is the highest value, what prevents someone from authentically embracing fascism or cruelty? Hesse lived through both world wars and the rise of Nazism, yet his philosophy offers little guidance for collective political action or moral judgment beyond the individual's inner development. Hesse's response to this critique, implicit in his work rather than explicitly stated, seems to be that genuine individuation will naturally produce compassion and ethical behaviour because it requires integrating all aspects of humanity, including the capacity for empathy. But this is more an article of faith than a philosophical argument. History has shown us plenty of people who pursued inner development while remaining ethically monstrous. The scholarly debate about Hesse's journey to selfhood ultimately centres on a question. Is this a genuine philosophy or a therapeutic worldview? A philosophy makes universal claims about reality and provides arguments for those claims. A therapeutic worldview offers a framework for individual psychological healing without claiming universal truth. Hesse seems to want his ideas to function as philosophy, to make claims about what human beings are and ought to do, but his method is essentially literary and introspective rather than argumentative. Yet perhaps this ambiguity is precisely what makes Hesse valuable. He occupies a space between systematic philosophy and lived experience, between abstract theory and concrete practice. His novels function as thought experiments in how to live, and they succeed not by providing answers, but by dramatizing the difficulty and necessity of the questions. The journey to selfhood in Hesse is not a solution, but a problem that each person must engage with in their own way. What remains philosophically vital in Hesse's conception is his insistence that becoming yourself is not natural or easy, that it requires courage and the willingness to destroy comfortable illusions, and that most people never attempt it because the cost is too high. Whether this is enough to constitute a philosophy is debatable, but it is certainly enough to make Hesse worth reading carefully rather than dismissing or romanticizing. Part 2. The Primal Duality, Spirit versus Nature. At the centre of Hesse's philosophical architecture stands what he called the primal duality, the fundamental opposition between spirit and nature, between Geist and nature, between the Apollonian and Dionysian dimensions of existence. This is not simply a restatement of the ancient mind-body problem. Hesse's version is more radical and more tragic. He believed that human beings are constitutionally split between two irreconcilable modes of being, and that this split is the source of both our greatest suffering and our only possibility for depth. The clearest articulation of this duality appears in his novel Narcissus and Goldmund, published in 1930. The two protagonists embody the opposing poles. Narcissus is the ascetic intellectual, a monk devoted to thought, discipline, and spiritual transcendence. Goldmund is the artist and sensualist, driven by physical desire, wanderlust, and the worship of earthly beauty. The philosophical argument of the novel is that neither path alone leads to wholeness, but also that synthesis is impossible. The two men remain friends across their lives, each envying what the other possesses, each incomplete without the other, yet each unable to inhabit the other's world. What makes this philosophically interesting rather than just a literary device is Hesse's insistence that the duality is ontological, rooted in the nature of reality itself, not merely psychological. He absorbed this conviction from several sources. From Nietzsche, he took the Apollonian-Dionysian distinction and the idea that Western civilization had made a catastrophic error in choosing Apollo over Dionysus, reason over instinct. From Schopenhauer, he took the notion that existence itself is suffering because we are torn between the will, our blind animal striving, and representation, our capacity for detached contemplation. From Gnostic and mystical traditions, he absorbed the idea that matter and spirit are opposing principles in cosmic conflict. But Hesse radicalized these influences in a specific direction. Unlike Nietzsche, who ultimately advocated for a fusion or transcendence of the duality, Hesse believed the split was permanent and necessary. The tension between spirit and nature is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured and transformed into art. This is a darker vision than most readers recognize. Let us examine the nature pole first. For Hesse, nature represents immediate sensory experience, sexuality, instinct, the body, change, multiplicity, and ultimately death. It is the realm of what he called the mothers, drawing on Goethe's Faust, the primal feminine principle associated with fertility, chaos, and dissolution. To live fully in nature means to embrace transience, to love what will die, to accept that all beauty decays. In Goldmund's journey through the novel, he pursues this path ruthlessly. He becomes a wanderer, takes countless lovers, experiences plague and violence, and eventually becomes a sculptor, trying to capture in wood the fleeting beauty of female faces. His art is an attempt to freeze the transient, to give permanence to what nature decrees must pass away. But the novel makes clear that this project is ultimately doomed. The perfect image he seeks, the Mother who contains all beauty, cannot be captured because she is death itself. Now the spirit pole. Spirit represents abstraction, timelessness, unity, discipline, thought, and the attempt to transcend the flesh. It is the realm of what Hesse called the father principle, associated with order, permanence, and law. To live in spirit means to seek escape from the body's demands, from time's passage, from the multiplicity of experience into the unity of contemplation. Narcissus embodies this path. He lives in the monastery, practices asceticism, studies theology and philosophy, and seeks truth through renunciation. But the novel reveals that his spirituality is also incomplete. He envies Goldman's capacity for immediate experience, for passion, for contact with the living world. His spiritual life is purchased at the cost of never truly living, never risking himself in love or suffering or creation. Here is where Hesse's philosophy becomes genuinely original and problematic. He argues that both paths are necessary and both are insufficient, but he does not believe in synthesis or balance. This is not a call for the golden mean. Instead, Hesse proposes that genuine human beings must oscillate between the poles, must live the contradiction fully rather than resolving it. You must be both ascetic and sensualist, both disciplined and wild, but not simultaneously, because the poles exclude each other. This oscillation is what he means by going through oneself. You cannot skip the sensual phase to reach spirituality, and you cannot remain in sensuality without eventually craving transcendence. The authentic person accepts this pendulum swing as the human condition, and does not try to escape it through false resolutions. The philosophical roots of this position are complex. Hesse is drawing on the dialectical thinking of German idealism, particularly Hegel's notion that reality proceeds through contradiction. But unlike Hegel, Hesse does not believe the dialectic resolves into synthesis. The contradiction remains, and this is where his thinking approaches what later philosophers would call existentialism, the acceptance of fundamental absurdity and paradox in human existence. Now we must interrogate this position rigorously, because it has both explanatory power and serious weaknesses. The strength is phenomenological accuracy. Many people do experience life as torn between competing impulses, between the desire for order and the desire for freedom, between spiritual yearning and physical need. Hesse's duality resonates because it describes a real tension in human experience. Moreover, his insistence that both poles are valuable challenges the Western philosophical tradition's privileging of reason over body, spirit over matter. In this sense, Hesse anticipates later feminist philosophy and phenomenology's rehabilitation of embodied experience. He refuses to denigrate the sensual in favour of the spiritual, even though he personally often leaned toward asceticism. But the critiques are substantial and cut to the heart of whether this constitutes a viable philosophy. First, there is the question of whether Hesse has constructed a false dichotomy. Contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science suggest that the sharp separation between reason and emotion, spirit and body, is itself a mistake. These are not opposing faculties, but integrated aspects of a unified cognitive system. Emotions are forms of cognition, and abstract thought is embodied. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has argued extensively that emotions contain judgments about value and are essential to ethical reasoning. If she is right, then Hesse's dualism rests on an outdated faculty psychology that modern cognitive science has undermined. The spirit-nature split is not an ontological fact, but a cultural construction that we can and should overcome. Second, there is what we might call the gender problem inherent in the duality itself. Hesse consistently associates nature with the feminine and spirit with the masculine. This is not accidental or superficial to his philosophy, it is structural. Women in his work represent the natural pole. They are bodies, mothers, sources of sensual pleasure, and ultimately death. Men represent the spiritual pole. They are thinkers, artists, seekers of transcendence. The feminist critic Simone de Beauvoir analysed this pattern in The Second Sex, though not specifically addressing Hesse. She argued that associating women with nature and immanence, while reserving transcendence and spirit for men, is a fundamental operation of patriarchy. It denies women full humanity by making them symbols rather than subjects. In Hesse's philosophy, women do not undertake journeys to selfhood. They facilitate men's journeys. This is not a peripheral problem, but reveals something essential about the limits of his thinking. Third, there is the Marxist critique that the spirit-nature duality is itself a product of class society and alienated labour. The philosopher Herbert Marcuse argued in Eros and Civilization that the conflict between pleasure principle and reality principle, which closely parallels Hesse's duality, is historically specific to capitalist society. In a world where labour is alienated and repressive, we experience our instinctual nature as opposed to social demands. But this is not an eternal human condition, it is the result of specific economic arrangements. From this perspective, Hesse's philosophy naturalizes and eternizes what is actually a historical problem with historical solutions. Rather than accepting the duality as permanent, we should work to create social conditions where work and pleasure, discipline and freedom are no longer opposed. Hesse's acceptance of the split becomes a form of resignation that prevents revolutionary change. Fourth, there is a problem internal to Hesse's own position. If the duality cannot be resolved, if we must oscillate between poles forever, what prevents this from becoming mere vacillation rather than depth? How do we distinguish authentic engagement with both poles from simple inability to commit to anything? Hesse provides no clear criterion, and this opens his philosophy to the charge of romanticizing indecisiveness. The existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard made a similar criticism of what he called the aesthetic stage of existence. The aesthetic individual tries to sample all experiences, to live in the moment without commitment, and this appears profound, but is actually a form of despair. Genuine existence requires choosing, committing, accepting limitation. Hesse's celebration of oscillation might be a failure to achieve this existential maturity. Yet defenders of Hesse can respond to these critiques. Against the cognitive science objection, they might argue that even if reason and emotion are integrated at a neural level, we still experience them phenomenologically as intention. Philosophy should address lived experience, not just biological facts. The duality describes how life feels, even if it is not ultimately ontologically fundamental. Against the gender critique, some Hesse scholars argue that his later work, particularly The Glass Bead Game, moves beyond crude gender associations and presents the duality in more abstract terms. This defence is weak, however, because the late novel still lacks genuine female characters undertaking their own journeys. Against the Marxist critique, defenders might argue that even in a less alienated society, humans would still experience tension between immediate gratification and long-term goals, between individual desire and social necessity. Some form of the duality seems built into the human condition of being temporal creatures with foresight. Against the Kierkegaardian objection, they might argue that Hesse's oscillation is not mere vacillation, but a higher synthesis that includes both poles without resolving them, a kind of negative capability that can hold contradictions without anxious resolution. The scholarly consensus on Hesse's duality philosophy is divided. Literary critics tend to value it as a rich symbolic framework that generates interesting narratives. Philosophers tend to find it either dated or under-theorized. Psychologists, particularly those in the Jungian tradition, often embrace it as describing real tensions in the individuation process. Feminist scholars almost universally criticize its gender essentialism. What remains valuable is Hesse's insistence that we not pretend human life is simpler than it is, that we not paper over genuine tensions with easy optimism or false syntheses. If his specific formulation of the spirit-nature duality is flawed, the underlying insight that humans contain contradictory impulses that cannot be fully reconciled remains important. The question is whether we should accept this as permanent tragedy, as Hesse does, or see it as a problem admitting of solutions he could not imagine. Part 3. The bourgeois world and its destruction. Hesse's critique of bourgeois society forms the third pillar of his philosophy, and it is here that his thinking most directly engages with the social and political conditions of his time. But we must be precise about what Hesse means by bourgeois, because he uses the term in a specific philosophical sense that goes beyond mere economic class. For Hesse, the bourgeois world is not simply the middle class or capitalist society. It is a comprehensive mode of existence characterized by conformity, comfort-seeking, fear of extremes, and the substitution of security for vitality. The bourgeois person has made a devil's bargain. They accept spiritual death in exchange for material stability and social respectability. They live in what Hesse called the lukewarm zone, neither truly alive nor truly dead, and they demand that everyone else join them in this comfortable hell. This critique appears most forcefully in Steppenwolf, where Harry Haller sees himself as caught between two worlds, the dying aristocratic culture of the spirit and the rising bourgeois culture of mediocrity. The novel's famous treatise on the Steppenwolf, a text within the text, diagnoses the bourgeois world as a Procrustean bed that cuts off whatever exceeds its narrow dimensions. Procrustes, in Greek mythology, was a bandit who made travellers fit his bed by either stretching them or cutting off their limbs, and Hesse sees modern society doing exactly this to human souls. The bourgeois world in Hesse's analysis, operates through several mechanisms of repression and reduction. First, it demands specialization and role-playing. You must be a good employee, a good citizen, a good spouse, a good parent, but never simply yourself in your contradictory fullness. Each role comes with scripts and expectations that have nothing to do with your authentic desires or nature. To function in bourgeois society requires performing these roles convincingly, and eventually the performance becomes your entire existence. Second, it valorizes moderation and condemns intensity. Any passion, any extreme experience, any genuine suffering or joy is suspect. The bourgeois ideal is balance, temperance, the golden mean, but Hesse sees this as a recipe for spiritual death. Real life happens at the extremes, in moments of ecstasy or despair, and the bourgeois world works systematically to eliminate these moments in favor of a flat, continuous contentment. Third, it substitutes entertainment for genuine culture. This aspect of Hesse's critique anticipates later Frankfurt School analyses of the culture industry. The bourgeois world produces a degraded mass culture designed not to challenge or transform, but to distract and pacify. In Steppenwolf, Halle is tortured by having to attend bourgeois dinner parties where people discuss art and music, but have no real relationship to beauty or truth. They consume culture as a status marker, not as a path to transformation. Fourth, and most insidiously, it normalizes this condition and makes alternatives appear pathological. Anyone who rejects bourgeois values is labelled mentally ill, immature, or dangerous. The bourgeois world cannot tolerate genuine outsiders because they remind everyone else of the life they have sacrificed. Hesse himself experienced this directly, criticized throughout his life for his refusal to settle into conventional existence. Now we must examine the philosophical underpinnings of this critique and ask whether it holds up to scrutiny. Hesse is drawing on several intellectual traditions here. From Nietzsche, he takes the concept of the last man, the creature who has given up greatness for comfort and claims to have invented happiness. From German Romanticism, he inherits the critique of Philistinism, the unimaginative materialism that cannot comprehend art or spirit. From his reading of Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism, he adopts the analysis of conventional life as sleep or illusion. But Hesse adds his own emphasis. The bourgeois world is not just philosophically mistaken or spiritually impoverished, it is actively malevolent. It kills souls deliberately and systematically because it cannot tolerate genuine life. This is a strong claim and requires examination. The strength of Hesse's critique lies in its phenomenological accuracy about certain aspects of modern life. Many people do experience their work lives as alienating, their social obligations as performances, their entertainments as empty distractions. The pressure to conform, to not make waves, to prioritize security over growth is real and widespread. Hesse articulates this experience powerfully and gives people language to name their dissatisfaction. Moreover, his diagnosis of how societies enforce conformity through normalization and pathologization has been validated by later thinkers. Michel Foucault's analysis of disciplinary power and the creation of normal subjects echoes Hesse's insights. The sociologist Irving Goffman's work on how we perform social roles confirms Hesse's intuition that modern life is fundamentally theatrical and inauthentic. Hesse also correctly identifies a genuine problem in modern mass culture: the commodification of art and the reduction of culture to entertainment. His critique anticipates Adorno and Horkheimer's concept of the culture industry by several decades. The transformation of aesthetic experience into passive consumption really does degrade both art and audiences. But now the critiques, and they are severe. First, there is the problem of class privilege, masked as spiritual critique. Hesse's attacks on bourgeois life are launched from a position of bourgeois security. He had the luxury to reject conventional employment, to pursue art and self-development, because he had financial support, first from his family and later from his literary success. His characters who reject bourgeois life are similarly privileged. They are not factory workers or peasants struggling for survival. The Marxist critic Georg Lukács made this point forcefully in his essay The Ideology of Modernism. He argued that Hesse's rejection of bourgeois life is itself a bourgeois luxury, a form of what Marxists call false consciousness. Rather than recognizing that the problem is capitalism itself, the system that produces alienation and commodification, Hesse blames individual attitudes and choices. His solution, individual spiritual rebellion, leaves the system intact and is available only to those with economic privilege. This critique has force. Hesse never seriously engages with questions of economic justice or structural inequality. His philosophy is fundamentally individualist. It offers no collective politics, no vision of social transformation beyond everyone individually awakening. But how is the single mother working 2 jobs supposed to embark on a journey of self-discovery? How is the wage labourer supposed to reject bourgeois conformity when non-conformity means unemployment and poverty? Second, there is the problem of nostalgia and elitism in Hesse's critique. When he attacks mass culture and bourgeois philistinism, he often implies that there was a better past, an aristocratic culture of genuine refinement and depth. This is historically naive. Aristocratic culture was built on exploitation and exclusion. It was available only to a tiny elite, and most of its products were no more profound than modern mass culture. Moreover, Hesse's disdain for ordinary pleasures and contentment can appear misanthropic. Is there really something wrong with wanting security, comfort, and simple happiness? Is the person who works a regular job, raises their children, and finds joy in modest pleasures really spiritually dead? Hesse sometimes seems to think so, and this reveals an unattractive aristocratic disdain for normal human life. The philosopher Agnes Heller, in her work on everyday life, has argued that ordinary existence has its own dignity and depth. The modernist intellectuals' contempt for everydayness reflects their own alienation, not a truth about everyday life itself. People who are not on spiritual quests can still live meaningful, ethical, even profound lives. Hesse's philosophy struggles to acknowledge this. Third, there is a performative contradiction in Hesse's position. He criticizes bourgeois society while writing for a bourgeois audience and achieving great bourgeois success. His books became bestsellers, he won the Nobel Prize, he lived comfortably in Switzerland, surrounded by the very comforts he criticized. This does not automatically invalidate his critique, but it does raise questions about whether he really offered an alternative or just a safety valve that allows bourgeois readers to feel rebellious while changing nothing. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would call this aesthetic distance, the way that cultured middle-class people distinguish themselves from the uncultured middle class precisely by consuming art that criticizes middle-class values. Hesse's novels become markers of cultivation, proof that you are one of the sensitive souls who sees through bourgeois superficiality, even as you remain fully integrated into bourgeois life. Fourth, Hesse's critique lacks specificity about alternatives. He is clear about what he opposes, but vague about what he proposes. The journey to selfhood, artistic creation, Eastern spirituality, these are fine as individual practices, but they do not constitute a social philosophy. If everyone rejected bourgeois life, what would replace it? Hesse offers no answer, and this makes his critique ultimately impotent as social criticism. Fifth, there is the question of whether Hesse's target even exists in the unified way he presents it. The bourgeois world is a construction, a philosophical abstraction that simplifies the enormous diversity of modern life. Real people do not neatly divide into bourgeois conformists and spiritual rebels. Most contain elements of both, and most negotiate the tension between social demands and personal authenticity in complex ways that Hesse's stark dichotomy cannot capture. The philosopher Charles Taylor has argued that the modern ideal of authenticity, which Hesse helped popularize, itself becomes a form of conformity. Everyone is trying to be unique and authentic, and this paradoxically creates new forms of social pressure and performance. The rebel becomes a type, non-conformity becomes mandatory, and we end up with what Taylor calls the culture of authenticity that is just as repressive as what it replaced. Despite these criticisms, aspects of Hesse's bourgeois critique remain valuable. His insistence that social normalcy is not the same as health or authenticity challenges the way societies pathologize deviation. His recognition that comfort and security can be purchased at too high a price, the price of never fully living, articulates a genuine danger in modern life. His diagnosis of how entertainment and distraction prevent confrontation with existential questions remains relevant in an age of smartphones and social media. What Hesse failed to do was connect his individual psychology to structural analysis. He saw that bourgeois society produces alienation, but did not adequately theorize the economic and political systems that generate this alienation. A more adequate critique would combine Hesse's phenomenological insights with Marxist structural analysis, showing how capitalism shapes consciousness while also taking seriously individual experience of that shaping. The scholarly debate about Hesse's social critique thus centers on whether it is a genuine contribution to critical theory or merely an expression of bohemian aestheticism. Left-wing critics tend to see it as the latter, a pseudo-rebellion that poses no real threat to existing power structures. Psychologically oriented scholars tend to value it as capturing real experiences of alienation and conformity pressure. The truth likely lies between these positions. Hesse identified real problems but lacked the theoretical tools to adequately explain or solve them. Part 4. Eastern Philosophy and the Illusion of Unity. Hesse's engagement with Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism and Taoism, represents both his most influential contribution and his most contested legacy. His novel Siddhartha, published in 1922, introduced millions of Western readers to Buddhist concepts and sparked enormous interest in Eastern spirituality. But scholars of Buddhism and comparative philosophy have long debated whether Hesse understood Eastern thought or merely projected his own preoccupations onto it. We must begin by understanding what Hesse encountered and when. His first serious exposure to Indian and Chinese philosophy came through reading Schopenhauer, who himself had engaged with Upanishadic texts and Buddhist ideas. In 1911, Hesse travelled to India, Ceylon, and Indonesia, a journey that profoundly affected him but also revealed the limits of his understanding. He did not speak Sanskrit, Pali, or Chinese. He had no training in textual scholarship, and his knowledge came primarily through German translations and secondary sources. What attracted Hesse to Eastern philosophy was its apparent solution to the problem of duality. Where Western thought seemed trapped in binary oppositions, spirit versus matter, subject versus object, eternity versus time, Eastern philosophy appeared to offer a way beyond opposition into unity. The concept of Brahman in Hinduism, the notion of emptiness or sunyata in Buddhism, the principle of the Tao that transcends all distinctions, all suggested a metaphysics that could heal the Western split. In Siddhartha, Hesse presents his version of the Buddhist journey to enlightenment. The protagonist begins as a privileged young man who renounces worldly life to become an ascetic seeker. He studies with teachers, practices extreme austerities, but eventually realizes that spiritual practices themselves can become obstacles to truth. He leaves the ascetic life, enters the world of sensual pleasure and business, loses himself in materialism and desire, and finally achieves wisdom through direct experience rather than doctrine. The novel's climax presents Hesse's philosophical synthesis. Siddhartha sits by a river and has a revelation. All things are simultaneous, all divisions are illusory. The river contains all time at once. Everything is connected in a unity that transcends language and thought. He realizes that the world is not illusion to be escaped, as traditional Buddhism teaches, but perfection to be accepted exactly as it is. The goal is not transcendence, but embracing totality. This is beautiful and resonant, and it made Siddhartha one of the most influential spiritual novels of the 20th century. But is it actually Buddhism? Scholars of Buddhist philosophy have raised serious questions. The Buddhist scholar Stephen Batchelor has argued that Hesse fundamentally misunderstands core Buddhist concepts. Buddhism does not teach that all divisions are illusory or that everything is ultimately one. Rather, it teaches that our habitual way of creating fixed independent entities is mistaken. Things exist dependently and impermanently, but this does not mean they dissolve into an undifferentiated unity. Moreover, Buddhism's goal is not acceptance of the world as perfect, but the cessation of suffering through understanding its causes. The Four Noble Truths diagnose suffering and prescribe a path to end it, not a mystical realization that suffering was always already perfect. Hesse's river revelation sounds more like Advaita Vedanta Hinduism or Western Romanticism than anything found in the Pali Canon or Mahayana Sutras. The comparative philosopher Heinrich Zimmer, who was Hesse's contemporary, made a similar point in his lectures on Indian philosophy. He argued that Western appropriations of Eastern thought typically impose Western categories and concerns while claiming to transcend them. What Hesse finds in Buddhism is essentially German Romantic nature mysticism dressed in Indian clothing. But we should be careful not to dismiss Hesse too quickly. The question of authenticity in cross-cultural philosophical borrowing is complex. Every interpretation is a creative transformation, and Eastern philosophy itself contains diverse schools that disagree with each other. Perhaps Hesse created a legitimate new synthesis rather than simply misunderstanding his sources. Let us examine what Hesse actually does with Eastern concepts in more detail. From Buddhism, he takes several key ideas: the concept of attachment as the source of suffering, the necessity of letting go, the inadequacy of intellectual knowledge alone, the value of meditation and direct experience, and the critique of ego or self as illusion. But he transforms each of these in ways that serve his own philosophical project. Take the Buddhist teaching on anatta, or no self, the doctrine that there is no permanent independent self. In Buddhist philosophy, this is a metaphysical claim about the nature of persons. We are constantly changing processes, not fixed substances. The realization of anatta is supposed to liberate us from ego clinging and the suffering it causes. Hesse appropriates this teaching but inverts its violence. For him, the realization that the self is multiple and changing becomes not liberation from self, but the path to true selfhood. Remember Steppenwolf's discovery that he contains not two, but thousands of souls. This is presented as affirming multiplicity, not transcending the illusion of self. Hesse uses Buddhist concepts to support a romantic psychology of self-actualization, which is almost the opposite of Buddhism's goal of eliminating self-centeredness. Similarly with detachment. Buddhist detachment or non-attachment means not clinging to impermanent phenomena, recognizing that nothing can provide lasting satisfaction. It is fundamentally about reducing craving and aversion. But Hesse's version of detachment is more aesthetic and contemplative, a kind of artistic distance that allows you to appreciate life as spectacle without being consumed by it. This is closer to Schopenhauer's aesthetic contemplation than to Buddhist equanimity. Hesse's most original contribution is his concept of simultaneity, the idea that all times and all perspectives exist at once in a higher reality that transcends linear experience. This appears most clearly in Siddhartha's river vision, and in the elaborate metaphysics of the glass bead game. Hesse claims this derives from Hindu and Buddhist concepts of Maya and the eternal present, but actually it is more influenced by German idealism and Western mysticism. The notion of simultaneity allows Hesse to reconcile opposites without eliminating them. Spirit and nature, asceticism and sensuality, the many and the one, all coexist simultaneously in what he calls the eternal smile, or the music of the world. This is not the Buddhist middle way, which steers between extremes, but a kind of totalizing vision that embraces all contradictions. Now we must ask, does Hesse's synthesis work philosophically, regardless of whether it is authentically Buddhist? The strengths are clear. Hesse genuinely grasped something important about the limitations of Western rationalism and dualism. His attempt to think beyond subject-object split, to imagine consciousness that is not separate from what it knows, addresses real problems in Western epistemology. His emphasis on experiential knowledge over doctrinal learning challenges the Western overvaluation of abstract theory. Moreover, Hesse's literary presentation of Eastern ideas, whatever its scholarly accuracy, effectively communicated certain truths to Western audiences. The notion that suffering comes from attachment, that ego is constructed rather than given, that meditation and inwardness can transform consciousness, all of these genuinely Eastern insights reached millions through Hesse's work. But the problems are equally clear. First, Hesse's version of Eastern philosophy eliminates its ethical and practical dimensions in favor of mystical aestheticism. Buddhism is not just about having mystical experiences, it includes detailed moral teachings, analyses of mental states, and systematic practices. Hesse reduces all of this to individual epiphanies and artistic sensibility. The Buddhist teacher and scholar B. Alan Wallace has argued that this pattern is typical of Western appropriations of Buddhism. They extract the mysticism while ignoring the ethics and psychology. They emphasize peak experiences while neglecting the gradual training that produces them. They individualize what was originally a communal practice. Hesse fits this pattern perfectly. Second, Hesse's synthesis often amounts to having your cake and eating it too. He wants the liberation of non-attachment without actually giving up attachment, the peace of ego transcendence while retaining and celebrating individual personality, the wisdom of accepting impermanence while trying to capture eternal beauty in art. This is philosophically incoherent, a superficial both-and that does not genuinely resolve tensions. Third, by presenting Eastern philosophy as primarily about mystical unity and acceptance, Hesse contributes to Western stereotypes that damage cross-cultural understanding. The East becomes associated with passive mysticism, the West with active rationality, and this obscures the diversity and complexity of both traditions. Contemporary Eastern philosophy includes rigorous logical analysis, practical ethics, and social engagement, not just mystical unity experiences. The post-colonial theorist Edward Said's concept of Orientalism is relevant here. Said argued that Western representations of the East typically project Western fantasies and anxieties rather than engaging with actual Eastern societies and thought. The East becomes a screen for Western desires, a repository of wisdom that the West supposedly lacks. Hesse's Eastern philosophy functions this way. It represents what the West wants the East to be, not what Eastern philosophy actually is. Fourth, there is the problem of cherry-picking. Hesse takes from Buddhism and Hinduism only what supports his existing commitments, while ignoring aspects that would challenge him. He embraces meditation and mystical experience, but ignores Buddhist teachings on rebirth, karma, monastic discipline, and the unsatisfactoriness of all conditioned existence. He celebrates Hindu unity metaphysics, but ignores the caste system and social hierarchy deeply embedded in traditional Hinduism. This is not synthesis, but selective appropriation, and it produces a philosophy that is neither genuinely Eastern nor coherently Western, but rather a hybrid that satisfies Hesse's personal needs without addressing the full implications of either tradition. Yet defenders of Hesse can make reasonable counter-arguments. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer argued that all understanding is interpretation, that we can only approach other traditions through our own horizons of meaning. By this standard, expecting Hesse to become an authentic Buddhist scholar is unrealistic. What matters is whether his engagement with Eastern ideas was sincere and whether it produced interesting new thoughts. Moreover, religious and philosophical traditions are always evolving through cross-cultural encounter. Contemporary Western Buddhism is itself a hybrid, and many Asian Buddhist teachers have praised Hesse for introducing Buddhism to the West, even if his version was not academically precise. The Zen teacher D.T. Suzuki, who knew Hesse's work, did not reject it as inauthentic, but recognized it as a Western response to Eastern wisdom. Finally, perhaps Hesse's greatest contribution was simply showing Western readers that alternatives to Western ways of thinking exist. Even if his understanding was limited, he opened a door through which many others passed who went on to deeper study. The explosion of interest in Buddhism, meditation, and Eastern philosophy in the West owes something to Hesse's popular novels, whatever their scholarly limitations. The scholarly verdict on Hesse's engagement with Eastern philosophy is thus mixed. Specialists in Buddhist and Hindu studies tend to be critical, seeing Hesse as perpetuating Western misunderstandings. Scholars of comparative literature and religion tend to be more generous, seeing his work as creative synthesis rather than scholarly analysis. The question ultimately comes down to what we want from cross-cultural philosophical engagement, academic accuracy, or transformative possibility. What remains philosophically interesting is Hesse's attempt to use Eastern concepts to address Western problems, even if the attempt was imperfect. The problem of how to think unity and multiplicity together, how to reconcile change and permanence, how to achieve peace in a world of suffering, these are genuine philosophical problems that both Western and Eastern traditions have addressed. Hesse's synthesis may not satisfy specialists in either tradition, but it represents a sincere effort to think across boundaries, and it inspired others to undertake similar journeys with greater rigour. Part 5. Art as the only path to meaning. If there is a single idea that unifies all of Hesse's work, it is this: in a world without transcendent meaning, without God or metaphysical truth, art remains the only genuine path to significance and the only adequate response to existence. This is not simply a claim about the value of art, it is a complete existential philosophy that places artistic creation at the centre of human purpose. Hesse's philosophy of art emerges from a specific intellectual context. By the late 19th century, Nietzsche had announced the death of God and the loss of absolute values. This created what later thinkers would call the problem of nihilism. If there are no transcendent truths, no eternal values, no cosmic purpose, why should we do anything at all? Nietzsche's answer was the creation of new values through the will to power and the affirmation of life. Hesse's answer was art. For Hesse, art is not decoration or entertainment or even primarily communication. Art is the human response to the fundamental condition of existence, that life is transient, suffering is universal, meaning is not given but must be created, and death erases everything. In the face of this bleak reality, art is the act of imposing form on chaos, of creating temporary islands of meaning in a meaningless universe. This philosophy appears most explicitly in The Glass Bead Game, Hesse's final and most philosophically ambitious novel. The novel presents a future society where an intellectual elite devotes themselves to the glass bead game, an elaborate symbolic system that synthesizes all human knowledge into aesthetic patterns. The game is pure form, pure play, pure artistic creation without practical purpose. It represents Hesse's vision of the highest human possibility. Life lived entirely as aesthetic creation. But the novel is more complex than this might suggest. The protagonist, Josef Knecht, ultimately rejects the pure aestheticism of the game and returns to the world of ordinary life and teaching. This has led to extensive scholarly debate about whether Hesse is ultimately endorsing or critiquing his own aesthetic philosophy. We will return to this question, but first we must understand the philosophy itself more fully. Hesse's aestheticism has several key components. First, art is the transformation of suffering into form. Life brings pain, loss, disappointment, death, and these cannot be eliminated or transcended. But they can be transmuted through artistic creation into something beautiful and meaningful. The artist does not deny suffering, but uses it as raw material. This appears clearly in Hesse's understanding of his own work. Each of his major novels emerged from a personal crisis that he transformed into art. Demian came from his psychoanalysis and his crisis of identity during World War I. Steppenwolf came from a period of severe depression and suicidal thoughts. Narcissus and Goldmund came from his wrestling with the spirit-nature duality. The glass bead game came from his attempt to imagine a life beyond his own struggles. In each case, art was how he survived and made sense of chaos. Second, art creates what Hesse calls magic, by which he means a transformation of consciousness that reveals hidden connections and patterns. Great art does not simply represent reality, it reorganizes perception so that we see reality differently. This is a quasi-religious function. Art provides epiphanies, moments of vision that break through ordinary consciousness. Third, art is play in the highest sense, not frivolous amusement, but the free creation of form according to self-imposed rules. The glass bead game exemplifies this. It has elaborate rules, but no external purpose. It exists purely for the joy of pattern-making and the beauty of the game itself. This connects to Schiller's concept of the play drive and to Nietzsche's vision of life as aesthetic phenomenon. But Hesse radicalizes it. All of life should become play. All seriousness should be transformed into artistic creation. Fourth, the artist is a specific human type, fundamentally different from other people. This is one of Hesse's most elitist and problematic claims. He believed that most people are incapable of genuine artistic sensibility, that they remain trapped in literal-mindedness and utilitarian thinking. The artist is someone who has escaped these limitations and can live in the realm of form and symbol. Fifth, art requires absolute devotion, a kind of secular monasticism. The true artist sacrifices everything else: relationships, comfort, social belonging, material success, in service to their art. This is not optional, but necessary. Art demands this sacrifice and will destroy anyone who tries to pursue it half-heartedly. Now we must examine these claims critically because they reveal both insights and serious problems. The insight is this: Hesse recognizes that meaning is constructed, not discovered, and that artistic creation is one of the fundamental human ways of constructing meaning. In a post-religious age, art can provide some of what religion once provided: community, ritual, transcendence, consolation, a sense that life matters. Moreover, Hesse is right that art can transform suffering in ways that mere acceptance or denial cannot. The process of creating form from chaos, of making something beautiful from pain, is genuinely therapeutic and meaningful. This has been confirmed by both psychological research on expressive therapies and phenomenological accounts of aesthetic experience. Hesse also correctly identifies the playful dimension of art, the way that artistic creation involves freedom within constraints, the joy of pattern-making for its own sake. This insight has been developed by later philosophers of play and game theory, who recognize that rule-governed but freely chosen activities are essential to human flourishing. But the problems are substantial. First, there is the question of aesthetic elitism. If art is the highest human possibility, and only a few people are capable of genuine artistic sensibility, what about everyone else? Are they doomed to meaningless lives? Hesse sometimes seems to suggest exactly this, and it is both morally objectionable and philosophically dubious. The philosopher John Dewey argued against this kind of elitism in art as experience. Dewey claimed that aesthetic experience is not limited to contemplating fine art, but permeates everyday life. The carpenter who takes pride in good work, the cook who creates a delicious meal, the parent who crafts a birthday party, all are engaged in aesthetic creation. Hesse's narrow conception of art as high culture produced by rare geniuses misses this broader truth about aesthetic dimension of all human activity. Second, there is the problem of art's relationship to ethics and politics. If art is the highest value and the artist's only obligation is to their art, what prevents artistic creation from becoming a form of narcissistic withdrawal from moral and social responsibility? Hesse faced this question directly during the Nazi period, when he was criticized for not taking a more active political stance against fascism. His response was that art itself is a form of resistance, that maintaining the integrity of aesthetic values in a time of barbarism is a political act. There is something to this argument. The philosopher Adorno made a similar point about how autonomous art resists the total administration of society. But it is also a convenient rationalization that allows the artist to avoid difficult choices and claim moral superiority while doing nothing. The philosopher Judith Shklar argued in her work on liberalism that the worst thing human beings do to each other is cruelty, and that our first obligation is to reduce suffering. By this standard, Hesse's aestheticism appears as a form of moral failure. He was so focused on artistic beauty and inner development that he inadequately responded to the massive suffering and injustice of his time. Third, there is the question of whether art really can substitute for religion or metaphysics as a source of meaning. Religion provided not just consolation and transcendence, but also moral guidance, community, purpose beyond the self, and hope for ultimate justice. Art may provide transcendent experience and meaning for the individual artist, but does it provide any of these other things? The sociologist Philip Rieff argued in The Triumph of the Therapeutic that modern attempts to replace religion with psychological or aesthetic fulfillment produce shallow substitutes that cannot sustain communities or provide genuine meaning beyond the self. Hesse's aestheticism may be another version of this, a sophisticated form of narcissism that mistakes intense subjective experience for objective meaning. Fourth, Hesse's philosophy of art contains a deep ambivalence that he never fully resolves. On one hand, art is the transformation of life into form, which seems to require distance from life, standing back to create patterns. On the other hand, art should emerge from lived experience, from direct engagement with suffering and joy. But how can you be both fully immersed in life and detached enough to transform it into art? This ambivalence drives the plot of the glass bead game. Joseph Knecht lives in Castalia, a province dedicated entirely to intellectual and artistic pursuits, isolated from the world's practical concerns. He achieves the highest position, becomes the master of the game, creates beautiful patterns that synthesize all knowledge. But he comes to feel that this pure aestheticism is a form of death, that he has sacrificed life for art, and the sacrifice was too great. So he leaves Castalia to become a tutor to a single student in the ordinary world. Then, in a shockingly abrupt ending, he drowns while swimming in a cold lake, having been in the ordinary world for less than a day. Scholars endlessly debate what this ending means. Is Hesse saying that pure aestheticism is wrong and we must return to life? Or is he saying that once you have lived in the aesthetic realm, the ordinary world can only kill you? Or is the point that there is no resolution, that we are caught between irreconcilable demands? This ambiguity may be Hesse's final statement on art. It is necessary but insufficient, the highest possibility but also a trap, the only meaning but also a flight from meaning. If this is his position, it is honest but not very helpful as a philosophy of life. Fifth, there is a gendered dimension to Hesse's aestheticism that feminist critics have noted. The artist in Hesse's work is always male, and artistic creation is implicitly compared to male sexuality and power. Women are muses, models, inspirations, but not artists in their own right. This reflects historical reality. Women were largely excluded from high culture and artistic training, but Hesse naturalizes this exclusion rather than questioning it. Moreover, the sacrifice that art demands, the renunciation of relationships and domestic life, is easier for men who have women to take care of their practical needs. Hesse himself had 3 marriages and multiple relationships, and women provided the emotional support and practical care that enabled his artistic work. His philosophy of art as requiring total devotion ignores this gendered labour that makes male artistic devotion possible. Despite all these criticisms, something important remains in Hesse's philosophy of art. He recognized that in a disenchanted world, aesthetic experience is one of the few sources of genuine transcendence still available. The moment when a novel or painting or piece of music reorganizes your consciousness, makes you see differently, connects you to something beyond your ordinary self, these moments are real and valuable. Moreover, Hesse was right that creation, the act of making something new, is fundamentally meaningful to human beings in ways that mere consumption or passive experience are not. We need to be creators, to impose form on chaos, to leave marks on the world, and this need is not reducible to evolutionary adaptation or social conditioning. It is part of what makes us human. The question Hesse could not answer, and perhaps no one can answer definitively, is whether art is enough. Can a life devoted to aesthetic creation be a fully meaningful life if it ignores ethics, politics, relationships, community, and the suffering of others? Or does art need to be integrated into a larger framework of human goods? Hesse oscillated between these positions throughout his life, and his final novel leaves the question open. Part 6. Time, Suffering, and the Eternal Moment. Underlying all of Hesse's philosophy is a distinctive metaphysics of time and a particular understanding of suffering that draws on both Western and Eastern sources, while remaining uniquely his own. This is perhaps the most abstract dimension of his thought, but it is also the most philosophically ambitious. Hesse's starting point is the recognition that temporal existence is fundamentally problematic. We live in time, experiencing moment after moment in linear succession, but this creates three interconnected problems. First, everything we value is impermanent and will be lost. Second, we are trapped in the present moment, unable to truly access past or future. Third, time itself seems to fragment existence into disconnected instants rather than meaningful wholes. This analysis draws on Schopenhauer, who argued that the will to live keeps us trapped in endless striving, where each satisfaction immediately gives way to new desire, making happiness impossible. It also draws on Buddhism's teaching that attachment to impermanent things is the root of suffering. But Hesse adds his own twist. The problem is not attachment per se, but our relationship to time itself. The solution Hesse proposes is the concept of the eternal moment, or simultaneity, what he sometimes calls the timeless realm. This is the idea that all times exist simultaneously in a higher reality that consciousness can access. Past, present, and future are not separate, but aspects of a single eternal present. When consciousness achieves the right perspective, usually through aesthetic experience or mystical insight, it can transcend temporal succession and experience everything at once. This idea appears most explicitly in Siddhartha's vision by the river. He realizes that the river is always the same river, even though the water constantly flows, that all moments of the river exist simultaneously, that birth and death are one, that everything is already complete and perfect in the eternal present. This vision supposedly brings liberation from suffering, because if everything exists eternally, then nothing is truly lost. A similar concept appears in the glass bead game's metaphysics. The game itself is supposed to represent the simultaneity of all knowledge, all cultures, all truths existing together in harmonious patterns outside of time. The master game player achieves a consciousness that transcends historical succession and sees everything at once. Now we must analyze this metaphysics carefully, because it makes several distinct claims that need to be separated. First, there is a claim about the nature of time itself, that linear succession is somehow less real than eternal simultaneity. Second, there is a psychological claim, that consciousness can transcend its normal temporal limitations. Third, there is a soteriological claim, that this transcendence solves the problem of suffering. Let us examine each claim. The metaphysical claim about time draws on a long Western philosophical tradition going back to Plato, who distinguished between the eternal realm of forms and the temporal realm of becoming. It also reflects Kant's distinction between noumenal reality outside time and phenomenal reality within time. And it echoes certain interpretations of Hinduism that see temporal existence as Maya or illusion compared to eternal Brahman. But modern physics and philosophy of time have largely rejected this framework. Physics tells us that time is a real dimension of the universe, not an illusion. The theory of relativity shows that simultaneity is relative to reference frames, not absolute. There is no eternal present that contains all times. There are only different temporal perspectives from different positions in space-time. Moreover, philosophers like Henry Bergson and Martin Heidegger argued that temporal existence is not a fall from eternity, but the fundamental mode of human being. We are essentially temporal creatures, and trying to escape time is trying to escape what we are. Heidegger claimed that authentic existence requires accepting our temporality, particularly our mortality, not trying to transcend it through mystical visions of eternity. The psychological claim is more interesting and possibly has some validity. Hesse is describing experiences that people do have, moments where time seems to stop or where past and present feel simultaneously present. These occur in aesthetic experience, mystical states, meditation, and sometimes in ordinary consciousness. The psychologist William James documented such experiences in the varieties of religious experience and took them seriously as forms of knowledge. Contemporary neuroscience has shown that our experience of time is constructed by the brain and can be altered in various ways. The sense of temporal flow, the feeling that we are moving from past through present to future, is produced by specific neural mechanisms that can malfunction or be modulated. So Hesse may be describing real alterations in temporal consciousness, even if his metaphysical interpretation of these experiences is questionable. But the soteriological claim that transcending temporal consciousness solves suffering is where Hesse's philosophy becomes most problematic. Even if we can occasionally experience moments where time seems to stop or where everything feels unified, how does this help with actual suffering? The pain of loss, the fear of death, the frustration of unmet needs, all of these continue regardless of whether we have mystical experiences of timelessness. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has argued forcefully against this kind of solution to suffering. In The Therapy of Desire, she examines ancient Greek and Roman philosophies that promise to eliminate suffering through achieving the right mental state. She concludes that these philosophies fail because they require giving up the attachments that make life meaningful. If we stop caring about temporal, impermanent things, we stop suffering, but we also stop truly living. Hesse's version has the same problem. If realizing that everything exists eternally eliminates the pain of loss, it does so only by making us not care about the particular temporal beings we love. But this is a kind of death, a giving up of the specific attachments that constitute our lives. The mother who loses a child is not consoled by being told that her child exists eternally in some timeless realm. She grieves precisely the temporal, changing, particular child who is gone. Moreover, Hesse's solution risks what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur called the temptation of totality, the desire to see everything at once from a God's-eye view. This temptation appears in many philosophical systems, the wish to transcend partial perspective and achieve absolute knowledge. But Ricoeur argues this is both impossible and undesirable. We are finite beings with limited perspectives, and this finitude is not a defect, but the condition of meaning. Stories and meanings require temporal sequence, not simultaneous totality. There is also a tension between Hesse's metaphysics of the eternal moment and his emphasis on becoming and self-development. The journey to selfhood takes time, requires living through different phases, demands temporal development. But if everything exists simultaneously in eternity, then there is no real development, no genuine change, no authentic journey. Hesse tries to have it both ways, affirming both temporal becoming and eternal being, but these seem incompatible. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze offers a different approach to time that might help clarify Hesse's intuition. Deleuze distinguished between chronological time, the succession of uniform moments, and what he called aion, the eternal time of pure becoming. In aeon, past and future insist or subsist in the present without being contained by it. Everything is always becoming without ever simply being. This is a way of affirming temporal existence without reducing it to simple succession or trying to escape into eternity. Perhaps what Hesse is groping toward is something like Deleuze's concept, not a timeless realm that contains all times, but an enriched temporal consciousness that can hold past and future in the present, that experiences time as creative becoming rather than mere loss. But Hesse's formulations lean too heavily towards static eternity and end up undermining the very temporality they claim to affirm. The relationship between suffering and time in Hesse's philosophy also deserves scrutiny. Hesse follows Buddhism in seeing attachment to impermanent things as a source of suffering. But unlike Buddhism, which prescribes a detailed path of ethical practice and meditation to address this, Hesse offers mainly aesthetic experience and mystical insight. This is less a solution than a coping mechanism available only to those capable of intense aesthetic or mystical experiences. Furthermore, not all suffering comes from attachment to impermanent things. Physical pain, injustice, cruelty, meaninglessness, these cause suffering regardless of our metaphysical views about time. Hesse's philosophy addresses only one kind of suffering, the existential angst of finitude and impermanence, while ignoring other forms of suffering that require political, social, and ethical responses rather than metaphysical ones. There is also the question of whether Hesse's mystical experiences of timelessness are genuinely insightful or merely psychological phenomena that he misinterprets. The philosopher Bertrand Russell made this argument about mystical experiences generally. They feel profound and revelatory, but this feeling is not evidence that they reveal truth about reality. Many different mystical traditions have contradictory visions that cannot all be true. The feeling of certainty that accompanies mystical experience is a psychological phenomenon, not validation of metaphysical claims. Yet there is something in Hesse's intuition that should not be dismissed entirely. The sense that temporal succession is not the whole story about time, that there are ways of experiencing time that are richer and more meaningful than mere clock time. This resonates with many people's experience. The phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that lived time is fundamentally different from objective time, that consciousness does not experience time as a succession of disconnected moments, but as a flowing unity where past, present and future interpenetrate. Hesse may be describing this lived time rather than proposing a literal metaphysics of eternal simultaneity. In moments of aesthetic experience or deep absorption, we do experience time differently, and these experiences are valuable and meaningful. The mistake is elevating this phenomenology into metaphysics and claiming that these altered experiences reveal a truer reality than ordinary temporal existence. The lasting value of Hesse's temporal philosophy may be primarily negative. His recognition that our ordinary relationship to time is problematic, and his insistence that we need to find ways of experiencing time that are less fragmented and more meaningful. But his positive proposal, the eternal moment of simultaneity, appears more as a beautiful vision than a viable solution to temporal existence and its suffering. Part 7. The Problem of the Other: Community, Politics and Isolation. The deepest weakness in Hesse's philosophy, the place where it most fails to provide adequate guidance for human life, concerns his treatment of other people and collective existence. Hesse's philosophy is profoundly individualist, focused almost entirely on the solitary journey of the self, and when it does address relationships and community, it does so inadequately and sometimes harmfully. Let us begin with how Hesse understands human relationships. For him, relationships are primarily instrumental to individual development. You encounter other people who help you discover aspects of yourself, who catalyze your transformation, who mirror your internal conflicts, but they remain essentially means to your self-actualization rather than ends in themselves. This appears clearly in Demian, where the mysterious figure of Demian exists primarily to help the protagonist, Emile Sinclair, discover his authentic self. Demian has no inner life of his own, no journey separate from his function in Sinclair's development. Similarly, in Siddhartha, the Buddha, Kamala, Vasudeva and all other characters exist to facilitate Siddhartha's journey. They are stations on his path rather than autonomous beings with their own paths. The philosopher Martin Buber offers a useful framework for criticizing this tendency. In I and Thou, Buber distinguished between two fundamental modes of relation. In the I-it relation, we treat others as objects to be used, analyzed, or manipulated. In the I-thou relation, we encounter others as subjects in their own right, meeting them in reciprocal dialogue where both are transformed. Hesse's relationships are almost entirely I-it, even when they appear intimate or profound. The feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir made a similar point about how existentialist philosophy often treats women. Male philosophers present their journey to authenticity, while women in their lives appear only as objects, as the other who confirms male subjectivity but has no autonomous subjectivity of her own. Hesse fits this pattern perfectly. His novels are Bildungsromans of male self-development, where women exist only to facilitate or obstruct this development. But the problem goes deeper than gender. Hesse's philosophy has no adequate theory of intersubjectivity, of how selves are constituted through relationships rather than in isolation. Contemporary philosophy of mind and developmental psychology have shown that selfhood is fundamentally social. We become selves through interactions with others. Our identities are dialogical rather than monological. Consciousness itself is shaped by linguistic and social practices. The philosopher Charles Taylor develops this insight extensively in Sources of the Self. Taylor argues that the modern ideal of self-discovery through inward turning is fundamentally mistaken because there is no pre-social self to discover. We are always already embedded in language, culture and relationships that constitute what we are. The journey to selfhood is not inward but outward, through engagement with others and with traditions larger than ourselves. From this perspective, Hesse's entire philosophical project rests on a false premise. The authentic self cannot be found through isolation and inward turning because the self is not that kind of thing. It is a nexus of relationships, a node in a network, not a hidden essence waiting to be discovered. Hesse's protagonists retreat from society to find themselves, but this retreat eliminates the very conditions that make selfhood possible. Now let us examine Hesse's treatment of community and collective life. He is deeply ambivalent about human communities, seeing them as both necessary and suffocating. The bourgeois community is oppressive and must be rejected. But the alternatives Hesse imagines are either temporary, like the Brotherhood of Wanderers in Goldman's Journey, or utopian and unrealistic, like the province of Castalia in the glass bead game. Castalia is particularly instructive as a vision of ideal community. It is a society entirely devoted to intellectual and aesthetic pursuits, isolated from political and economic life, governed by merit and dedicated to cultural preservation and the glass bead game. But the novel itself shows that this community is sterile and parasitic. It produces nothing of practical value. It depends on the larger society's labour to support it, and it cuts members off from the very life experiences that give art and thought meaning. Joseph Knecht's decision to leave Castalia can be read as Hesse's recognition that his ideal community is not viable. But what alternative does he propose? Knecht goes to serve as tutor to a single student, a model of relationship that is still fundamentally hierarchical and focused on individual development rather than collective flourishing. Hesse cannot imagine genuine egalitarian community where people work together toward shared goals. This failure becomes most apparent when we consider Hesse's response to the massive political crises of his time. He lived through both world wars, the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the Cold War, and his philosophical response to all of this was essentially to withdraw into aesthetic creation and individual spiritual development. During World War I, he helped prisoners of war and published anti-nationalist essays, which was courageous. But his ultimate message was that individuals should work on themselves rather than trying to change political structures. The critic Georgi Lukács attacked Hesse fiercely for this apoliticism, seeing it as bourgeois evasion of real political responsibility. When fascism was destroying Europe, Hesse was writing about mystical unity and the beauty of the glass bead game. This is not morally neutral, it is a political choice to prioritize individual cultivation over collective resistance. Hesse would respond, and his defenders do respond, that maintaining humanistic values and artistic integrity during times of barbarism is itself political action, that totalitarian regimes hate and fear genuine culture, that preserving beauty and truth is a form of resistance. There is something to this argument, but it is also self-serving. It allows intellectuals and artists to avoid difficult and dangerous political engagement while claiming moral superiority. The philosopher Hannah Arendt provides a useful framework for thinking about this issue. In The Human Condition, she distinguished between three fundamental activities: labour, work, and action. Labour is the activity of biological maintenance. Work is the creation of durable objects, including art, and action is political engagement with others to create and maintain the public world. All three are necessary for fully human life. Hesse's philosophy valorizes work, artistic creation, while denigrating or ignoring action, political engagement. But Arendt argues that action is essential to human flourishing, that we realize our humanity through appearing in the public realm, speaking and acting with others to shape our common world. Without action, without politics in the noble sense, we retreat into private existence and abandon the public world to tyrants. Hesse might respond that politics is inherently corrupting, that power structures necessarily produce alienation and oppression, that the individual journey to selfhood is the only real revolution. This is essentially an anarchist position, but anarchism at least has a political theory about how to organize society without coercive authority. Hesse offers no such theory, only a rejection of politics itself. The psychologist Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, analyzed how individualism can become a flight from the anxiety of freedom into either authoritarian submission or automaton conformity. True freedom requires both individual authenticity and positive engagement with others to create a just society. Hesse's radical individualism, by lacking any vision of positive freedom through collective action, leaves people isolated and vulnerable to the very forces he criticizes. There is also a class dimension to Hesse's apoliticism that cannot be ignored. His characters have the luxury of focusing on spiritual development because they are not struggling for survival. The working-class person, the peasant, the colonized subject, these people cannot afford the journey to selfhood that Hesse prescribes. They need political change to address material oppression. By ignoring class and economic structures, Hesse's philosophy becomes a luxury good available only to the privileged. Furthermore, Hesse's vision of human nature is fundamentally pessimistic about collective action. He seems to believe that people in groups inevitably become mobs, that collective movements always degenerate into conformity and violence, that only the isolated individual can maintain integrity. But history shows this is false. People have organized collectively for justice, have created democratic movements, have achieved progressive change through solidarity and cooperation. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas offers an alternative vision in his theory of communicative action. Habermas argues that human beings can engage in rational dialogue aimed at mutual understanding and consensus, that we have capacities for cooperation and justice-seeking that are as fundamental as our capacities for domination and conflict. A philosophy that ignores these capacities and focuses only on individual inwardness is both descriptively inadequate and normatively impoverished. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of Hesse's individualism is its effect on his readers. Millions of people have read his novels and found in them permission to withdraw from political engagement, to focus on personal growth while the world burns, to treat relationships as instrumental to self-development rather than as valuable in themselves. This may not have been Hesse's intention, but it is the effect of a philosophy that valorizes solitary journeys and aesthetic withdrawal. Yet we should also recognize what Hesse does contribute on these questions. His critique of shallow collectivism and mob mentality is valid. People do lose their individuality in groups. Conformity pressure is real. Mass movements can become oppressive. His insistence that genuine social change requires individuals who have done the work of self-understanding is not wrong. It is insufficient. We do need both individual authenticity and collective action, not one or the other. Moreover, in an age of social media and constant connectivity, Hesse's defense of solitude and inwardness has renewed relevance. We are in danger of losing the capacity for sustained reflection, for being alone with ourselves, for thinking independently of the crowd. Hesse reminds us that this capacity is valuable and needs to be cultivated. But ultimately, Hesse's philosophy of the other remains his greatest failure. A complete philosophy of human life must address how we live together, how we balance individual authenticity with collective responsibility, how we create just communities that allow individual flourishing. Hesse gestures at these questions, but never adequately engages them, and this makes his philosophy a partial vision that can guide individual spiritual seekers, but cannot guide communities or political movements. Part 8. Final synthesis and the scholarly verdict. We have now examined all the major dimensions of Hermann Hesse's philosophy. His theory of the journey to selfhood, his metaphysics of duality, his critique of bourgeois society, his engagement with Eastern thought, his aestheticism, his temporal metaphysics, and his treatment of relationships and politics. The time has come to synthesize these insights, assess the overall coherence and value of his philosophical project, and deliver a final scholarly verdict on his lasting contribution. Let us begin by identifying what unifies Hesse's disparate ideas into something approaching a systematic philosophy. At the center stands a single driving concern. How can a human being achieve authentic existence in a world that systematically prevents authenticity? Everything else in his thought radiates from this question. The journey to selfhood is his answer to the question of what authentic existence means. It means discovering and creating your unique identity through painful confrontation with all aspects of yourself. The duality of spirit and nature explains why this is difficult. We contain contradictory impulses that cannot be reconciled, only held in tension. The critique of bourgeois society diagnoses the external obstacles. Social conformity systematically crushes individuality. Eastern philosophy provides tools: meditation, acceptance, the transcendence of ego. Art offers the method, transforming suffering into beauty, creating meaning through form. The temporal metaphysics promises liberation. Transcending succession into simultaneity eliminates the pain of loss. This is a coherent vision, and it addresses genuine human concerns. The problem of authentic existence in modern society is real. People do feel alienated, trapped in roles, unable to discover who they really are. Hesse provides language and images that help people name and work through these struggles. This is no small achievement. But coherence is not the same as adequacy, and when we assess Hesse's philosophy against the standards of systematic philosophy, serious problems appear. First, there is the epistemological question. How does Hesse know what he claims to know? His method is primarily introspective and literary, drawing on his own experiences and intuitions. But introspection is notoriously unreliable, and different people's introspections yield contradictory results. Without some account of how to validate or falsify his claims, they remain personal testimony rather than philosophy in the strict sense. Second, there is the logical question. Do his various claims fit together consistently? We have noted several tensions between becoming and being, between accepting duality and transcending it, between individualism and the social constitution of identity, between aesthetic withdrawal and engagement with life. Hesse acknowledges some of these tensions but does not resolve them, and it is not clear whether they are productive paradoxes or simple contradictions. Third, there is the normative question. Even if Hesse's descriptions are accurate, do his prescriptions follow? He describes the human condition as torn by duality and suffering, but does it follow that we should respond through artistic creation and mystical insight? Why not political action, or religious faith, or scientific understanding, or ethical commitment to others? Hesse assumes without argument that his preferred responses are best, but this is precisely what needs justification. Fourth, there is the empirical question. Are Hesse's claims about human nature supported by evidence from psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and history? Some are. We do construct identity narratively. We do experience tension between different impulses. We do need meaning beyond material satisfaction. But others are not. The self is not radically individualist. Authentic existence does not require rejecting social bonds. Art is not the only source of meaning. Temporal transcendence does not eliminate suffering. Now let us examine the major scholarly camps and debates about Hesse's philosophy. These divide roughly into 5 positions. The devotees, primarily among general readers rather than scholars, see Hesse as a profound spiritual guide whose insights into selfhood and meaning remain timeless. They read his novels as wisdom literature, finding in them validation for their own spiritual journeys. This reading is sincere and meaningful for many people, but it is not critical scholarship. The literary critics, particularly those working in German literature, value Hesse primarily as a novelist rather than philosopher. They analyze his narrative techniques, his symbolism, his place in the tradition of the Bildungsroman, his experiments with form. From this perspective, philosophical coherence is less important than literary achievement, and Hesse succeeds brilliantly as a creator of powerful narratives, even if his philosophy is problematic. The Jungian psychologists see Hesse as a literary interpreter of individuation, someone who dramatizes psychological truths that Jung theorized more systematically. They read the novels as allegories of the psyche's journey toward wholeness, and they value Hesse's intuitive grasp of unconscious dynamics. This reading has merit, but tends to psychologize everything, missing the philosophical and political dimensions. The political critics, primarily on the left, attack Hesse for bourgeois escapism, for providing a pseudo-rebellion that serves as safety valve for middle-class dissatisfaction while changing nothing. They see his individualism as politically reactionary, his aestheticism as evasion of responsibility, his Eastern borrowings as Orientalist fantasy. This critique is often harsh, but contains important truths about the limitations and dangers of Hesse's vision. The comparative philosophers try to assess Hesse's synthesis of Western and Eastern thought, asking whether it represents genuine philosophical insight or merely confused eclecticism. The consensus here is mixed. Hesse grasped something important about limitations of Western rationalism, but his understanding of Eastern philosophy was superficial, and he projected Western romantic concerns onto Eastern concepts. Beyond these camps, there is the broader question of Hesse's historical significance and lasting influence. During his lifetime, from the 1920s through the 1960s, Hesse was enormously influential, especially among educated youth seeking alternatives to conventional values. The counterculture movement of the 1960s adopted him as a spiritual forefather, and millions discovered Eastern philosophy through his novels. But since the 1970s, Hesse's reputation has declined significantly in academic circles. He is rarely taught in philosophy departments, often dismissed as popularizer rather than original thinker. Feminist critics revealed the gender problems in his work. Post-colonial scholars criticized his Orientalism. Political theorists found his individualism inadequate for addressing systemic injustice. Scholars of Buddhism and Hinduism rejected his interpretations as distorted. Yet Hesse continues to be widely read by general audiences. His novels still sell steadily, and new generations keep discovering him. This suggests he meets some enduring human needs that academic criticism misses or dismisses. What are these needs? First, the need for narratives of transformation that take inner life seriously. In an age dominated by external measures of success, by quantification and optimization, Hesse reminds us that the inner journey matters, that becoming yourself is a real and difficult task. Second, the need for alternatives to pure rationalism and materialism. Hesse points toward mystical, aesthetic, and spiritual dimensions of experience that scientific worldviews often ignore or dismiss. Even if his specific formulations are flawed, the gesture toward something beyond the measurable and calculable resonates with many people. Third, the need for permission to not fit into conventional life. Hesse's protagonists are misfits who refuse bourgeois normality, and this gives courage to readers who feel similarly alienated. The validation that it is okay to be different, to reject the prescribed path, is valuable even if Hesse does not provide clear alternatives. Fourth, the need for beauty and meaning in response to suffering. Hesse's insistence that suffering can be transformed into art, that meaning can be created through form, speaks to the human need to make sense of pain rather than simply enduring it. These needs are real and important, and Hesse addresses them in ways that many people find helpful. The question is whether his philosophy provides adequate responses or merely consoling illusions. The strongest case for Hesse's lasting value would emphasize his role as a transitional figure who helped Western culture grapple with modernity's challenges. He articulated the alienation and meaninglessness that many experienced in the early 20th century. He introduced Eastern philosophical concepts to Western audiences, even if imperfectly. He insisted on the importance of individual authenticity against mass conformity. He demonstrated through his art that literature can be a vehicle for philosophical ideas. The strongest case against Hesse would emphasize that his solutions are inadequate and sometimes harmful. His individualism ignores the social nature of selfhood and provides no basis for collective action. His aestheticism is a form of privilege that evades political responsibility. His engagement with Eastern philosophy is superficial and Orientalist. His treatment of women is sexist. His temporal metaphysics is based on experiences he misinterprets. His philosophy offers no help with the most pressing problems: systemic injustice, collective violence, environmental destruction, the need for better social institutions. My own assessment, attempting to weigh these considerations fairly, is that Hesse is a minor but not negligible figure in the history of philosophy. He is not a systematic philosopher like Kant or Hegel, not an original thinker like Nietzsche or Heidegger, not a rigorous analyst like the Vienna Circle or Quine. But he is a significant literary philosopher who dramatized important questions about authentic existence, who synthesized diverse intellectual currents into accessible narratives, and who influenced millions to think more deeply about meaning and selfhood. His lasting contributions are primarily negative and diagnostic rather than positive and prescriptive. He is better at identifying problems than solving them, at dramatizing tensions than resolving them, at asking questions than providing answers. This is not nothing. Good questions are valuable, and Hesse asks genuine questions about how to live authentically in modern society. Where he succeeds, recognizing that social conformity threatens authenticity, that becoming yourself requires painful self-confrontation, that meaning must be created rather than discovered, that art and aesthetic experience provide forms of value that scientific rationalism misses, that Western thought has limitations that engagement with other traditions can illuminate. Where he fails, providing no adequate account of ethics or politics, treating relationships as instrumental to individual development, offering solutions available only to the privileged, romanticizing isolation and withdrawal, misunderstanding the Eastern traditions he borrows from, valorizing suffering in ways that can be harmful, lacking systematic philosophical rigor. The ultimate question is whether Hesse should be read as philosophy or as literature expressing philosophical themes. I incline toward the latter. He is a novelist who explores philosophical questions through narrative rather than a philosopher who happens to write novels. His medium is character and story, symbol and image, not argument and analysis. Judged as literature with philosophical content, his work succeeds brilliantly. Judged as systematic philosophy, it falls short. But this distinction may not matter much to readers who find meaning and guidance in his work. Philosophy is not only what happens in academic journals and monographs. There is also philosophy as a way of life, as existential orientation, as the pursuit of wisdom through reflection on experience. In this broader sense, Hesse remains a philosophical writer worth reading, arguing with and learning from, even when we reject much of what he claims. The final verdict: Hermann Hesse's philosophy is a flawed but valuable attempt to address authentic questions about human existence. It succeeds in raising problems, dramatizing tensions, and pointing toward dimensions of experience that deserve attention. It fails to provide adequate solutions, systematically integrate its insights, or address crucial political and ethical questions. It remains influential not because it is philosophically rigorous, but because it speaks to enduring human needs for meaning, authenticity, and transformation. Read critically, with awareness of its limitations and dangers, Hesse can still provoke valuable reflection on how to live. Read uncritically, as offering complete answers rather than partial insights. His philosophy can encourage narcissistic withdrawal and political irresponsibility. The challenge is to take what is valuable while rejecting what is harmful, to use Hesse as a starting point for thinking rather than as a destination.